I think there's still aspirational there, and these, even though a smartphone is the essential device for everyone around the world now, these other devices, are still desired and still very useful for a lot of people.
Hey gang, it's Monday, October 25th. Jason, Karen, and listeners, welcome to the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Newstar. I'm Marcus, and today I'm joined by two folks. Let's meet them. We start with our principal analyst covering Western Europe. It's Karen von Abrams.
Hi, Marcus. Great to be here.
There she is. Thanks for joining us. We're also joined by Jason Mander, who is the Chief Research Officer at GWI.
Hi, Marcus. Hi, everyone.
Hey, chap. Thank you for hanging out as well. So, before we get started, today's fact. Barcode scanners read the white bars, not the black ones. Unbelievable. This one staggered me to sit down. I was sitting down already. But that's crazy. You think of a barcode, it's like, oh yeah, the little thing, black lines, numbers underneath. No, it's reading the white ones this whole time. So, as it normally goes, I went down a rabbit hole and looked at some other barcode facts. So here's three for you. Number one, barcode was invented by Norman Joseph Woodland and Bernard Silver, patented in the US in 1951. The invention was based on Morse code that was extended to thin and thick bars. Number two, the first commercial product with a barcode scanned was at Marsh's Supermarket in Troy, Ohio. Number three, barcodes are scanned with a 99.99% success rate, unless you're using self-checkout. And then we all know it works some of the time. They're the worst. Anyway, today's real topic, the most important trends in media. So folks, we're talking all about the most important trends in media today. Why? How did we get here? Well, Karen, Jason, for a number of years now, you two have collaborated on this project called the Global Media Intelligence 2021 report. It's not always 2021, it is this year. That investigates internet users' traditional and digital media usage in 43 countries. So, Jason, we'll start with you. If you could quickly explain to the folks how and why you put this together.
Sure. So GWI surveys hundreds of thousands of internet users per year across more than 45 countries, asking them a wide range of questions about their digital lives and lifestyles, everything from the social media and apps they're using right through to how they interact with brands online. Each year, we tabulate that, crunch all the numbers, and then send it over to Karen, who works her analysis magic. And the goal really is to understand not just sort of what people are doing, but how that varies between country and region and the implications that brings for the industry.
Terrific. That's how it happens. It's happened this year. It comes out when?
It's already out as of the 21st.
21st. Okay, so it's already available for you folks. And we thought we'd go through some of the standout trends from that report. Just give you a little flavor of what's in there. So we've got a handful for you. We're going to go through them each in turn. That's how things work. We'll start with the rise of smart products across multiple countries and demographics. So this is one of the ones that you guys wanted to talk about. What's going on here?
We've been waiting for what you might call the smart product revolution for several years now. And prior to this year, the numbers had been creeping up. They were going in the right direction, but they weren't really accelerating. This year, for the first time, we've seen really quite meaningful growth in a lot of categories. So smart watches, smart wristbands, smart home products, smart video cameras, smart doorbells, that sort of thing. Whereas in previous years, we might have seen them rise by a percentage point here and there. This year, across country after country and demographic after demographic, they've been increasing by 3, 4, 5, 6 percentage points. Now, that might sound quite small to some people, but actually based on what had been happening in previous years, that does represent real acceleration. Smart watches are one of the biggest winners. And if you pick out some individual countries, you can see the changes that are going on. So over the last 2 years in a country like Australia, smartwatches have gone from 12% ownership to 20% ownership. In Canada, it's 9 to 16%. In the USA, it's 13% to 21%. That is pretty significant growth in a category that was a slow burner for a while, suddenly gaining real momentum. And it would look like you have to think a COVID influence here. Lots of smart home products or smart health trackers suddenly had a new sort of purpose or interest in people's lives. And it does look like significantly more have gone out and purchased as a result. There are some of the natural peaks that you would expect. So by age, it's 25 to 44s. Interestingly, not so much 16 to 24s who might not have such great disposable income. Urban residents are more likely to have invested than rural. And most unsurprisingly, there's a very strong income effect. So the wealthier the segment, the more likely they are to have invested in all forms of smart products.
Right. Karen, how about you? What jumped out to you with regards to the rise of smart products across these countries?
Well, it's certainly true that there is this link with affluence that Jason was pointing out. And certainly with smart home products, that's particularly marked. It's also true, that's not surprising, it's also true that the greatest penetration is often in very advanced economies. Again, no big surprise. But I was interested to find that for the first time, 1 in 4 internet users polled in the UK said they had a smart home device of some type this year. That's actually higher than it is in the US, where it's more like 1 in 5, just over 20%. But both of those very important milestones to have crossed, I think. And something else I would point out that links into the whole digital video boom that we certainly saw in 2020 and which is continuing in a lot of ways in 2021 is the rise in smart TVs. And this is, I think, a product that just about every internet user polled is interested in. And again, penetration was up markedly in a number of countries. We actually found that in a lot of cases now, over 50% of internet users have a smart TV, actually own a smart TV, which to me, again, is a very important milestone to have crossed.
Absolutely. On that, how many countries? Are we talking like a handful? Are we talking like the majority of countries we covered in terms of smart TV ownership going above that 50% threshold?
Jason, I'm not sure. You probably have a better sense of this than I do, but I would say that at least a third of the countries.
So globally, it's now about 4 in 10 who say they personally own one.
Wow.
That does cross the 50% threshold in, I think it is about a third of countries, very much concentrated on the mature markets where that's typical across a lot of the categories. Actually, interestingly, one of the only smart categories where it seems to be a little bit more even is on smart home security products, where a lot of the emerging markets are really not that far behind the mature ones, and places like China, Vietnam, Turkey showing quite strongly for smart security products.
Okay, because the smart home devices, you point out household security systems, energy consumption monitors, things like that. Karen, you mentioned in the UK it's 1 in 4, which would be 25%. In the US, 1 in 5, which is 20%. However, amongst, across the board, it's closer to kind of 15%. So they are, high numbers for the US and UK, but not too far in front of the pack. Smart TVs, finally, Japan, somewhat of an outlier, you note. How come?
So Japan is often an outlier for this type of data. There are a number of reasons that can help to explain that. For example, it's much older population and digital adoption is always lower among the older age groups. But also culturally, a lot of Japanese respondents are sometimes less willing to report what they personally own. So you can find that reported ownership isn't as high as you might expect. Also, for something like a smart TV, there's often a discrepancy between what the industry might think of as a smart TV and what the respondent might think of as a smart TV. So a lot of people out there probably do have smart TVs from our perspective, but don't necessarily themselves think of it that way. Right.
Yeah, we just talked about this in an episode about this kind of Trojan horse effect of smart TVs, how you want a new TV, you want a bigger TV, still a flat screen TV, you go buy one and chances are it's a smart TV, it's an internet connected TV because that's just what's being sold at the moment. The same way if you go to a store and buy a phone, if it's above $300 or $400, it's probably going to be a 5G device whether you wanted it or not. As we're talking about Japan as an outlier in smart TVs, just 9% of internet users owned a smart TV this year in Japan, up from 7.5 last year, but still low compared to some of those markets getting above 50% ownership for smart TVs. Let's move on to our second trend here, folks. Declining ownership of PCs and laptops, but a modest increase in several countries in the time people spend on them. What's going on here?
So this is definitely another coronavirus influence. Really, the overall trend is still the same. In each of the years leading up to this, we've seen a decrease in the numbers who own products like PCs, laptops, and tablets. And generally, that direction of travel is still the case, especially in the mature markets. But there are two things of interest. One is that actually in most of the countries, time spent on PCs, laptops, and tablets went up a little bit or stayed steady this year. It didn't carry on falling. And actually in some of the emerging markets, we saw an increase in time spent as well. So I think the pandemic is having an influence on how much time we spent on our devices over the last 12 months and 18 months, particularly during those periods where we were stuck at home, and they were one of the ways to pass the time. But also as internet penetration rises in emerging countries and more people are coming online, there's a little bit more of an appetite for some of the devices that seem rather traditional and maybe a touch boring to us in countries like the UK and the US.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I was struck by the fact that a lot of heavily mobile countries in Asia Pacific, for example, there were actually some significant increases in ownership of the larger screen devices, so PCs and tablets, because I think there's still, I don't know if you'd agree, Jason, that there's still aspirational there, and these, even though a smartphone is the essential device for everyone around the world now, these other devices, are still desired and still very useful for a lot of people.
Yeah, absolutely. They are aspirational. They can be status symbols in some cultures. And I think that helps to explain why places like Colombia, Brazil, Philippines, we're seeing a 30-minute or more year-on-year increase in the time spent on these devices.
Wow. Yeah, because China, I remember, with the mobile penetration, one of the reasons that it went so high so fast was because they leapfrogged the computer, the desktop, the laptop device. It was more expensive, and it was a lower income country, at least in the last couple of decades now, more affluent, more middle class, but their way to get onto the internet was through the smartphone. So a lot of people leapfrogged the computer. You note that between H1 2020 and H1 2021, penetration of desktops, laptops, and tablets fell in virtually every market. You say China, Japan, and Thailand aside. So those three markets, it is going up to a certain extent. So I was also noting Gartner IDC analysis both suggesting the worldwide PC market grew in Q3, but at a slower rate than we've seen during the pandemic. IDC and Canalys both pointing to supply issues with shortages expected to persist into the first half of 2022. Folks, were there any other kind of standout markets when it came to ownership of PCs and laptops and time spent on them? Or is it just a sense that kind of things have stabilized in terms of the number of people using them and time spent is up somewhat? Any countries that really kind of jumped out?
I mean, I think the one thing I would want to make clear here is let's not lose sight of the smartphone dominance. Smartphones are still absolutely the number one device. They are the most owned, the most preferred. They're capturing, in most emerging markets, the most amount of time. And they're the one that people complete the widest range of activities on. So yes, it's interesting that time's gone up a little bit on the larger devices, and that the trend we've been seeing of declines has weakened a little bit this year. But I think the overall direction of travel here is still very clear. It's the smartphone you need to be betting on. And let's see what happens next year if we go back to kind of business as normal as the coronavirus effect hopefully recedes a bit.
Yeah, that's a great point, I think. And I mean, absolutely, the smartphone is it. But speaking, for example, on behalf of Germany, an advanced economy where, the population skews a bit older than a lot of other markets, and it's a fairly well-to-do market. In Germany, for example, there's still, I think, something like nearly 84% of people said they had a larger screen device. And that's, again, one of the countries where the time spent on PCs and laptops, tablets, is still much greater than on mobile phones. So there are still these more traditional markets, or as Jason was saying, the ones where there were larger screen devices first and the smartphone came afterwards. And especially with an older population, they tend to hang on to those other devices, especially if they're old enough for their eyesight to be failing.
I think it's a really good example of why you need to understand each market and your target audience in that country. When we're looking at data from 45 plus countries, it's easy to make sweeping generalizations, but you will always find the exception, whether that's a country or a region that's behaving a bit differently, or a demographic within a country. Don't assume that the general trends we're highlighting here will apply universally across everywhere and everyone.
Absolutely, yeah. We've already pointed out a number here. Smart TV ownership in Japan, really low. The amount of time spent and the usage of PCs, computers, laptops in Germany, over-indexing. So no, it's an exceptional point.
We'll take a quick word from our sponsor and then we'll be right back with the conversation. Are you prepared for marketing's next chapter? You won't want to miss Brave New World's 2021, the virtual marketing and analytics event of the year, on November 9th and 10th. Join Brave New Worlds to learn how you can adapt to the forces redefining advertising. It's free, and you'll hear from today's top minds in marketing, data, and analytics, including executives from Facebook, General Motors, Capgemini, Publicis, and more. Go to bravenewworlds.newstar to register today. Right, folks, we are back with Jason and Karen talking all about the most important media trends of right now.
Let's move on to our third trend here. Strong growth in things like time spent on podcasts, TV streaming, music streaming, but traditional alternatives, Jason, you were noting, traditional alternatives largely holding their own. So newer behavior is not a direct replacement for older ones. What's going on?
Yeah, I'm going to throw some stats at you. So for TV streaming, Netflix and the like, year on year increases in time spent in 34 of the 34 countries where we've got trendable data. For podcasts, increasing time in 38 of the 42 countries. For music streaming, increased time in 37 of the 42 countries. So the general trend very clearly here is that newer media sources like podcasts, TV streaming, music streaming are attracting a bigger share of the consumer's daily media activities. But we're not seeing them directly replace what we might call traditional alternatives. So radio, broadcast radio, stable pretty much everywhere this year. And broadcast TV still a very major force. There are only a handful of countries, so China, India, Saudi, UAE, Vietnam, where people say they're spending more time on streaming than broadcast TV. Even there, it's very close. And actually this year in 16 of the countries we track, broadcast TV managed a small increase. So the myth we kind of need to dispel is that more time spent on streaming and podcasts means less time on the traditional activities. It doesn't necessarily mean that at all. It seems rather that people are just diversifying their media portfolios.
Yeah, that's a great point. They seem to be adding, when digital goes up, it's because they've added new time. We've seen this in a number of different areas with traditional media. We've seen newspaper readership. Newspaper readership in the US, I think it's close to 90 to 100 million people still read a newspaper, once a month, but ad spend is a fraction of what it used to be. TV ad spend as well. TV ad spend has been, I think, $68 billion for years now. It was 10 years ago. It is today. It will be 5 years into the future. It's just that digital is growing and people's use is growing and the ad dollars are growing, but not to the detriment of those more traditional means.
I was going to jump in here and say I have a theory. I may have a theory about the way in which so many forms of media consumption are increasingly coexisting and while the total time is going up. And I was wondering whether, especially during this pandemic era, it's partly a question of variety. It's, people, especially if they're at home, you don't want to do, even if you're a confirmed video freak, you don't want to be watching video all the time without a bit of variety, maybe some broadcast radio, maybe some live TV, and maybe some podcasts thrown in, because that may be more attractive than, as it were, continuing a focus on something that was already growing, like digital video, for example. But I don't actually know if that theory holds water. That's based sort of on a personal guess about the likely need to vary the kinds of inputs you have from media.
I think that's a great shout. And this year, more than ever, that's clearly going to be an influencer on the factors. I think the underlying point still holds, though, that even before coronavirus was the pain in our lives that it has become, we found that increased adoption of new digital behaviors did not lead to automatic rejection of old ones. So absolutely this year, variety as well will be adding to that. But I think that the general point still holds.
So you note that in many countries, the share of folks watching digital video has overtaken the share of people watching broadcast TV. But then you point to the fact that GWI included YouTube in its list of tracked video services for the first time this year, which boosted those video figures. Is that why digital video has overtaken the share of people watching broadcast TV in many countries, or is video just getting to that point?
I think video is just getting to that point. Again, adding YouTube into that set of services tracked would have helped, but it's amplifying a trend that was already in existence. If you look at the year-on-year trends for online TV, it was growing, especially among the younger demographics. So yeah, online TV is just on the rise. If you think about how many services are now available to people, how many different ways and places people have to engage versus broadcast TV, I think that helps to contextualize the figures a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was also struck by the fact that there are really big increases in consumption of paid-for services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, all the variety of these around the world. I mean, yeah, obviously GWI tracks a large number of these, which makes it incredibly helpful to actually gauge the proper size of this market, of these kinds of, new behaviors. But I'm sure that COVID has helped take subscription video on demand higher than it would otherwise have done, even in relation to 2020. So this year, we're looking at some data from the first half of 2021 and comparing it with, for the most part, absolutely comparable data from the first half of last year, 2020. But even though there were already pandemic behavior effects kicking in the first half of last year, there are significant increases. And I mean, I was really struck, for example, by the fact that in almost half of countries, more than 3/4 of the people polled, the internet users polled, said that they'd seen subscription video on demand in the prior month. So as someone who keeps an eye out for, these sort of milestones, as I've said before, when a figure like that is passed, it really seems to me this is a massive movement.
Yeah. On that point, Karen, that number's jumped out to me as well. Almost half of countries surveyed, over 75% of internet users had watched SVOD in the last month. China, India, Mexico, South Africa, the UK, the US. By contrast, just to point out another outlier country, just 29% of internet users in Russia had recently watched an SVOD service. Let's move on to our fourth trend here. We're talking about time spent on social and messaging stagnating or even falling somewhat. What's happening?
Well, let's be clear. We were at a very, very, very high point for social and messaging adoption. There were a lot of countries where people were spending 3 hours plus on average per day across social and messaging. And I think there comes a point where you can't really get much higher. So this year, we've seen time decrease in 13 of the countries that we track, only going up meaningfully by more than a few minutes in just one country. In the majority of the markets, there's no meaningful change year on year. So for now, I'd say social and messaging services have kind of reached as high as they're going to get into our daily lives.
And when you say decreasing, Jason, do you mean like they've gotten to that point, they can't really go any higher and they've kind of gone down by a point or two and it's not really that meaningful, or they've actually kind of dropped by 5 or 6 points and there's something there?
Yeah, in most cases, it's very, very marginal, like 1-2 minutes per day less than the previous year. So I'd say it's stagnation really, or plateauing rather than a decrease.
Okay.
One thing I found especially interesting this year is that you were delving a little bit deeper into these behaviors at GWI and asked not only about social networking, in fact, 37 named social networks, but also about messaging services. And I think being able to break those two out has yielded some very interesting insights from my point of view. I was interested to note, for example, that in some countries there are substantially more people using a messaging service, or indeed a number of services, than there are going to social media. And in other countries, it's actually the opposite way around. And in some countries, for example, a lot of those in Asia Pacific, there are, almost everyone you've polled is on both all the time. But those details I found a very interesting insight into what's going on.
Yeah, it's fascinating seeing which countries are really going for messaging services and which are really going for social media. But what strikes me most of all, I was looking through the data earlier, is if you look at the most popular social media or messaging service per country, there are only about 5 markets where it's not one of Facebook's army of services. So Turkey is a bit of an exception because it's Instagram, but almost everywhere else it's either WhatsApp or Facebook that tops the table. The exceptions really are only where there are very strong local market players. So Russia, it would be VK, China, WeChat. In both Japan and Taiwan, it's Line, and in South Korea, it's Kakao. But everywhere else, it's one of Facebook's services. So the next time you see a headline saying that Facebook is losing its influence, have a bit of a reality check and look at just how prevalent its various services are across the world.
Yeah, that's remarkable.
And then, of course, when it goes down, it has a rather enormous impact, as I think we were all seeing not so long ago.
Yes. On that point, so we covered that in an episode. We're actually going to be covering that in an Around the World episode, which is our international show, and looking at the effects of that outage, that Facebook outage, and WhatsApp, Instagram, all of its own properties, that outage and how that affected the different markets across the country. So stay tuned for that episode.
Yeah, the other thing I'd say it's worth looking at is the platforms which are growing the most. So Facebook's various services are dominant, and Instagram and WhatsApp are still gaining ground. But if you're looking at fastest growing, then TikTok is still the name to watch. Even just in the last 6 months alone, our data shows it going up by 6 points, and it's now almost half globally who are using TikTok. There's growth coming from Discord, Snapchat, Telegram as well, but wow, it's TikTok that is the service still to watch.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of TikTok and Facebook and Instagram and all the others, one of the other trends you guys wanted to talk about that stood out to you was the prevalence of multi-networking. What does that mean and what's going on here?
So when we're talking about multi-networking, we're really just talking about the number of services that any one individual is using. And what strikes us is how many people are using more than 10 different services, which sounds a huge number. But when you think about those you just reeled off and add Pinterest, LinkedIn, Twitter to the mix, it's easy to see how you can very quickly get to about 10.
And by services, you mean social media services?
Yep, social media and messaging services. Yep. So our data overall would show that about 98% are using at least one social media or messaging service. But strikingly, almost half of the internet users we poll are using 7 or more. And 14% of the internet users we poll are using 10 or more, with a definite skew in Asia Pacific and Middle East. It's very much those two regions where multi-networking is the strongest.
What's fascinating is that in our professional lives, at least in mine, it's a nightmare having that many places to reach people. It's like, do I Slack you? Do I call you? Do I email you? Do I text you? Do I set up a Zoom meeting? Do I do a Google Meet? There's too many ways to get in contact with people. Or do I get up and walk over to the desk if we're still in the office? Whereas apparently in our personal lives, 7+ different ways to reach people is fine. Sounds like a nightmare.
Yeah, I'm curious, Jason, do you have a profound theory about why this is happening? Because is it compartmentalization? Is it because young people especially are adding new options as they come onto the market? So there's a novelty factor. What's your insight into what might be behind this?
I think you've hit the nail on the head. So at GWI, we also track the reasons that people are using social media and messaging. And the biggest multi-networkers are those who have the most diverse reasons for using them in the first place. And it's also highest among younger groups. So among those younger demographics, people are probably slightly smarter at how they use social media. So if you think 5-10 years ago, everyone did everything on Facebook. Now, particularly among the savvier users, they very much go to their preferred or the right platform for the particular activity they want to do. So let's say product research is very firmly on Pinterest. Posting their latest photo might very firmly be where they go to Instagram for. It's kind of knowing their audience, and it's a smarter form of social networking almost.
Mm-hmm. Also fascinating to see, you note, you say most Latin American and Asia Pacific countries, internet users spending over 3 hours a day on social networking and messaging. Across most of Europe, though, social media occupying less than 2 hours per day. So big variations between time spent and by region. Let's finish by talking about voice search, another trend that jumped out to you guys, and the different use cases of voice search. Talk to me.
Yeah, this was something that I was really pleased to see this year because, again, the GWI data has gone into a bit more detail than in previous years, which is absolutely great. And in fact, internet users were asked about 2 different purposes for voice search. One, to actually find out information, and the other to perform some sort of task. And if I'm not wrong, I think you've also altered the time frame of that question to the previous week, whereas it had been in earlier surveys the prior month that internet users were asked about. So again, as with social networking and the messaging, to split these two things up did reveal some very interesting contrasts to me. And in some countries, there were more people looking for information with voice. In other cases, there was a strong sort of tendency to prefer it for completing tasks. And obviously, of course, a lot of people do both. But there were variations that I found intriguing.
With regards to those variations, which one was more popular? Were more countries looking for information or taking action?
It's a great question. So the data shows globally that just over a third of consumers on a weekly basis are using voice search for one of those two functions. And actually, it splits quite equally. So about 24% say they're using voice search for finding information. About 23% say that they're completing actions. And of course, some people are doing both of those things. But it tends to be in the mature markets, so Western Europe, North America, Australasia, where people are more likely to use it for one or the other rather than doing both. It tends to be in the emerging markets where perhaps the full utilization of voice has been more fully embraced and people are doing it for both. But regardless of the exact split by country, what's very clear is that people aren't yet utilizing voice search to its full potential. The very fact that some people are only using it to find information or only using it to complete an action suggests that we need to do more to get it ingrained in people's sort of day-to-day, week-to-week behaviors.
All right. That is all we've got time for, unfortunately, for the lead story. It's time now for the post-game report, where we summarize the key takeaways in a handful of seconds. Let's start with Karen, and then we'll go to Jason straight after. Karen, do you want to give us one or two takeaways from the show?
Yeah, I think what stood out to me, particularly in the context of COVID and the pandemic and habits formed that will probably persist, I have been very struck by the rise in subscription video on demand, just because when you think that people can get so much without paying online in terms of TV, video, all kinds of other entertainment visually, the fact that so many more people are paying speaks not just to a really strong demand, but also the fact that the SVOD providers are making the most of the opportunity.
Terrific. Jason, how about you? What's your takeaway from the show?
Totally agree with what Karen just said. I also say take note of the trends that are growing this year, but recognize the things that are still dominant. So mobile, social, still occupying huge amounts of time. Things that are growing are often from quite a small base, so it might be some time before they start really challenging for the mainstream dominance of some of the existing formats and media sources.
That is all we have time for. The report is called Global Media Intelligence 2021. How can they find it? Where can people go?
Well, clients can go to www.emarketer.com or indeed via Insider Intelligence. It's big, it's action-packed, and we're very, very pleased to have been able to work with GWI again on this. It's always a pleasure, and we do think clients are going to find it incredibly valuable.
Terrific. You can also click the link in the show notes to go directly to the report if you are an eMarketer Pro subscriber. That's all we've got time for today's episode. Thank you so much to my guests. Thank you to Karen.
Thank you so much. It's been really fun.
Yeah, thank you to Jason.
Thanks, everyone.
And thank you to Victoria. She edits the show. Thanks to everyone listening in. I'll see you guys tomorrow, hopefully for the Behind the Numbers Daily, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Newstar.